It was introduced as a breakthrough for people living with serious pain. One pill, 12 hours of relief, a lower risk of addiction, according to the company selling it. Doctors believed the promise. Prescriptions exploded. Billions of dollars flowed into Purdue Pharma. But behind the sales charts, an American public health disaster was already beginning.
For most of the 20th century, doctors in the United States were careful about administering powerful opioid medications. Drugs related to morphine were necessary for surgery and treatment of injuries and cancer. At times, they were the only remedies for pain that would otherwise have been excruciating and untreatable. But doctors knew too that opioids could be habit-forming, addicting, and potentially fatal due to breathing that stopped altogether. For many patients with chronic pain, though, this caution led to something else. It led to undertreatment. People were left in pain, their distress ignored or shrugged off as a normal part of their condition, a symptom they should just put up with. In the late 1980s and early 90s, a movement grew within American medicine that said pain was not being adequately treated. Doctors were encouraged to treat pain. Hospitals devised pain scales so patients and doctors could accurately gauge pain's intensity. This change addressed a genuine problem, and it created a business opportunity of monumental scale. Purdue Pharma was a privately held pharmaceutical company controlled by the Sackler family. Before it would sell OxyContin, the company had enjoyed success selling OxyContin, a slow-release morphine drug primarily used to treat cancer pain. The slow-release Contin formulation kept medicine circulating in the body steadily, rather than all at once. But OxyContin was about to go off patent, and the company knew the threat of generic alternatives to its cash cow would cut deeply into its profits. Purdue needed a successor product. The company identified OxyContin, another potent opioid, as its next target. Purdue developed a slow-release formulation that could provide 12 hours of pain relief. It was branded OxyContin. In December 1995, the FDA approved the drug. In 1996, Purdue began marketing and selling it. The drug had real medical applications, and in some cases provided valuable prolonged relief to patients in great need of it. For some people with significant chronic pain, 12 hours of sleep, or the ability to carry out basic tasks, could feel revolutionary. But Purdue did not intend for its new pain pill to be restricted to a small class of patients in severe need. The company saw a much larger market waiting for the taking. Backaches, arthritis, workplace injuries, injuries sustained during surgery or at a dentist's office. The many millions of Americans living with chronic illness. To unlock that market, Purdue would need doctors to think of OxyContin as fundamentally different from older opioid drugs. It wanted them to think of it not as an exceptional treatment that warranted exceptional care, but as a convenient, modern, and safer choice for managing ordinary pain. The drug would be sold on science, relationships, and what proved to be one of the most aggressive marketing campaigns in the history of American medicine. Purdue was doing more than selling a pill. It was preparing to redefine how a nation perceived pain. But Purdue's biggest innovation wasn't the pill itself. It was the system it built to sell it. The company sent representatives out into doctors' offices across the United States, equipped with scientific presentations and reams of data on how they should be prescribing. Doctors were assured that OxyContin's controlled-release mechanism delivered consistent 12-hour pain relief. The message that the drug's addiction potential was low, when used for pain, became gospel. Sales representatives were rewarded with bonuses tied to how much they prescribed. Those who reached high prescription numbers received more support. Teams targeted areas where injuries, physical labor, and chronic pain led to demand. They provided coupons for free first prescriptions. Purdue paid for lectures, speakers, and conferences, so doctors would know and like its representatives. They weren't just advertising a drug. They were constructing an environment in which prescribing it was seen as modern, humanitarian, and clinically prudent. OxyContin prescriptions soared from tens of millions of dollars to more than $1 billion a year. Inside Purdue, increased prescription volume was presented as a measure of success. Millions of potent opioid pills flowed from Purdue into American homes, finding both legitimate pain relief and diversion, addiction, and overdose. The controlled release had a critical flaw. While designed to release the drug slowly if swallowed whole, it could be crushed, and in so doing release the full dosage immediately. Soon, reports of misuse were flooding the communities where doctors were prescribing most heavily. Pharmacies started to see an odd rise in prescriptions for this new drug by name. Families witnessed friends and neighbors' transformations following an injury and a prescription for OxyContin. Law enforcement agencies started tracking overdoses back to prescriptions. But the commercial engine churned on, with Purdue asserting its drug was safe and effective and framing abuse as a matter of personal failure, not corporate responsibility. What, after all, was a drug maker's duty to a community it actively encouraged to embrace a powerfully addictive substance? Every new prescription to a doctor's practice was a doorway, and Purdue's sales reps were building a network to get a vast quantity of real pills to real communities. By the early 2000s, warning signs had become too obvious to ignore. In parts of Appalachia, New England and elsewhere, OxyContin was linked to addiction, theft, illegal sales and death. Some areas, hit particularly hard because of the mining and factory work their populations relied on and the many injuries that result, welcomed the prescription's pain relief. For some, though, relief turned to reliance. As the cost climbed or prescriptions ran out, patients sought alternatives. The crisis didn't just stop at OxyContin. Prescription dependence also created a population at risk for other opioids, starting with heroin and eventually including illicit fentanyl. Purdue didn't single-handedly start the opioid crisis. Doctors prescribed the drugs, pharmacies filled them, distributors supplied massive amounts, regulators monitored the system. Other pharmaceutical companies also sold opioids. Hard economic times, limited healthcare and lack of addiction treatment contributed to the disaster. But Purdue played a major role in shaping the marketplace, marketing a potent opioid widely and making claims about its addiction risk that the company's own affiliate would later concede were false. Inside Purdue, concerns accumulated about suspicious doctors who prescribed, and about suspicious sales activity. Some doctors wrote and received prescriptions at astounding volumes, becoming both lucrative customers and red flags to sales reps and other employees. The company knew what it was doing, said J.N. Greelan, a retired Drug Enforcement Administration agent who investigated Purdue for years. According to federal authorities, Purdue continued to sell OxyContin to hundreds of doctors and other providers who it knew or had reason to believe were dispensing the pills illicitly. At one point, one doctor, nicknamed by his patients the Candyman, received visits from Purdue representatives more than 200 times, the Justice Department alleged. The disconnect between Purdue's public statements and its private knowledge became too stark to sustain. While Purdue spoke publicly about safe prescribing practices and pointed to misuse as the culprit, it had internal data identifying prescribers of the highest volume, information that identified not just where patients were suffering but also who was generating the company's biggest profits. Families started to sue. States launched investigations. Journalists dug into the flow of money. Federal investigators pored over what Purdue's executives had told doctors about how dangerous OxyContin was. In 2007, Purdue Frederick, a subsidiary of the company, pleaded guilty to misleading regulators by marketing OxyContin from 1996 to 2001 as safer, less habit-forming, less likely to be abused and diverted, and less likely to cause withdrawal symptoms than alternative painkillers, the Justice Department announced. 3 company executives pleaded guilty to misdemeanor charges of lying to the government. They agreed to pay $634.5 million in fines, forfeitures and penalties. To many that sounds like a heavy blow. But OxyContin had already brought in billions of dollars. The company survived, its sales machine kept running and the Sackler family continued to hold the reins. The 2007 guilty plea should have changed Purdue. A company now had a criminal conviction tied to the marketing of its biggest seller. An American public had been shown how some of the most central sales messages about OxyContin were deceptive. But the financial logic never wavered. OxyContin kept making the company a huge amount of money. The opioid painkiller market stayed enormous. Purdue continued to market the product under more and more scrutiny. Federal prosecutors concluded in later admissions that, from 2007 to at least 2017, Purdue had conspired to defraud the United States and to undermine the efforts of the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration to enforce controls over prescription opioids. According to the company's later admissions, it told the DEA that it had a program in place to deter diversion of its products. It continued to market to doctors who it knew or should have known were prescribing their drugs in a manner that was risky or otherwise unsafe. and the company admitted it had been part of schemes to pay for doctors to prescribe the drugs. Money went to speaker programs and to consultants. A health software company was paid to develop software alerts that urged doctors to prescribe Purdue's extended-release drugs. Years after the guilty plea should have served as a final wake-up call, the company found new ways to protect its sales. Consultants were brought in to improve its sales performance. McKinsey advised Purdue in 2013 on how to turbocharge sales of OxyContin. Years later, McKinsey would pay $650 million to settle federal investigations into its work on opioids. Meanwhile, over the years, members of the Sackler family took billions of dollars out of Purdue. The Supreme Court of the United States would later note that Sackler distributions rose dramatically after the 2007 plea agreement. Even as the company moved closer to the edge of legal jeopardy, cash was moving from Purdue into the hands of its owners. Across the country, the opioid epidemic took on new forms. Some prescription opioid addicts shifted to heroin. Others even more quickly to illicit fentanyl, making the drug crisis much deadlier. Purdue wasn't responsible for all of these developments or all of these deaths, but it had helped build the foundation for them all. A real medical need transformed into a spectacular sales operation, played out in doctors' offices around the country. Addiction was downplayed and growth in prescriptions rewarded, even as evidence of devastating consequences mounted. Inside the company, the economics never failed to make sense for years. Another prescription meant more revenue in hand today. Another overdose, another family torn apart by grief, was happening someone else's sales chart. They had manufactured a market out of suffering. And now the legal system was preparing to transform that market into thousands of lawsuits. By 2019, Purdue Pharma was cornered. States, cities, counties, tribal governments, hospitals and individuals had filed lawsuits accusing the company of having helped fuel the opioid crisis. Their claims were too big for Purdue to satisfy through normal litigation. In September 2019, the company filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. Bankruptcy typically gives a struggling company a structured framework for resolving its debts and remaining in business. But Purdue's situation involved a more complex issue. The company had sought bankruptcy protection. The Sackler family had not. Nevertheless, a proposed reorganization plan sought to provide them broad protection from opioid-related civil liability in exchange for their financial participation. Supporters said it would deliver billions of dollars for treatment, prevention and compensation of victims without years more of litigation. Critics said wealthy owners who hadn't sought bankruptcy shouldn't be shielded the same way as the bankrupt company. In 2020, Purdue Pharma pleaded guilty to 3 federal felony offenses relating to fraud and kickback conspiracies. That criminal resolution came with billions of dollars in penalties, though Purdue's bankruptcy made much of it simply claims against an unable-to-pay-all obligation. The debate over legal protections for the Sacklers wound its way to the United States Supreme Court. In June 2024, the court rejected the bankruptcy plan, ruling that the bankruptcy code did not permit the mandatory release of claims against the Sacklers without the consent of claimants. That scuttled the existing settlement framework. But negotiations went on. In 2025, Purdue, the Sackler family, states and other parties reached a new settlement valued as high as $7.4 billion. This agreement earned support from every eligible state and United States territory. A bankruptcy judge gave it approval in November 2025. In May 2026, the national settlement went into effect as a legal matter. Under the agreement, the Sackler family will relinquish control of Purdue and will be barred from marketing opioids in the United States. Money from the settlement will be dispersed over years to governments, communities, those harmed by addiction and for the funding of treatment, recovery and prevention efforts. The money is real, but it is not restoral. A settlement cannot bring back a person lost to overdose. It cannot replace a childhood irrevocably marred by addiction. It cannot unknow the years that warning signs were ignored to chase profits. Purdue's story is not a call to leave pain untreated. Powerful pain medications have a legitimate and often necessary role in medicine, and patients need and deserve relief, accurate information and diligent care. It is, rather, a testament to what happens when the manufacturers of a dangerous product control information about its risks, and then reward the people who most avidly promoted its use. Purdue did not invent addiction. It did not operate in isolation. But it amplified addictive tendencies into a blockbuster with marketing that played down the dangers. The company measured success in sales, market share and the number of prescriptions it filled. America measured the consequences in shattered families, strained communities and stolen lives. This is the Noir Ledger, where every fortune leaves a paper trail, and where the cost of relief sometimes comes later, much later, with interest,